Morning. This is Political Science 3400A, Public Administration, the second lecture on budgeting and financial management dated March 20th, 2020. In our last class, we looked at the differences among macro, micro, and meso-level budgeting, and some of the broader contexts in which budgetary activities take place. In today's class, we will be looking at internal competition associated with the bureaucratic politics of budget making and implementation, and issues associated with micro-budgeting, that is, budgeting at the level of smaller organizational units. In our next class, we will discuss the relationship between budgeting and risk management. Traditional models of Weberian bureaucracy assume a centralization of power in the hands of central authorities and the senior public servants who report to them. However, just as royal advisors and factions within governing parties have competed for influence in pre-democratic regimes, so there is often competition among and within departments and agencies of contemporary governments to hold on to existing resources, budgets, personnel, and jurisdiction, and to expand their access to budgetary funding. In terms of budgetary policies, this competition is often framed as the competition between guardians, central agencies which seek to set overall government policies and conserve the resources necessary to meet them, and spenders, departments and agencies which deliver programs and services to various clients within governments and broader publics. The guardian-spender dichotomy is often traced to the great American scholar and political scientist Aaron Wildavsky, Wildavsky. It was popularized in Canada by Donald Savoy, some of whose work you've read in this course, and in his 1990 book, The Politics of Public Spending. And David Good uses the concept extensively in his book, The Politics of Public Money. Good emphasizes that money is one of the central currencies of influence for politicians and public servants. Those officials with discretionary access to resources and the capacity to allocate or reallocate the resources of others have greater influence than those who must seek permission from others to obtain new resources, or in some cases, hold on to what they already have. This reality is a key source of the power and influence of federal and provincial finance ministers and their senior officials. However, the capacity of finance ministers to exercise that kind of power depends in large measure on the continuing support of prime ministers or their respective premiers. It also depends on well-trained public servants with strong analytical capacity, the capacity to evaluate alternative budgetary policies and strategies, and to provide elected officials with effective tools for policy advocacy for their discussion with prime ministers, premiers, and cabinet colleagues. The forces of inertia in budgeting that we talked about in Wednesday's class means that every department or agency of government and the broader public sector expects to continue all the activities that it has budgeted for in previous years, while receiving bigger budgetary allocations year by year to cover the costs of inflation, population growth, wage increases for staff, and incremental improvements or extensions in services to its relevant publics. So in the dialectic of guardians and spenders, all government departments seek to expand their budgets to increase their activity and services provided to different groups of citizens and organized interests inside and outside governments that benefit from those activities. That can be made to work as long as the economy is growing faster than the combined rates of inflation and population growth, although it leaves precious little room for policy innovation or the reallocation of spending from areas of lower priority or relative ineffectiveness to areas of higher priority. But in practice, the contest of guardians and spenders reflects the constant reality of big government in the modern era. To balance the interests and objectives of individual parts of government and society with concepts of the wider public good which involve constant trade-offs between multiple goods valued by various members of society. It is the constant effort to reconcile the interests of the different parts that make up the whole, not just of governments or the broader public sector, but of the wider society that they supposedly exist to serve. At the same time, while citizens enjoy access to quality public services, at least the ones they benefit from, they typically want to be better off after taxes from one year to another. These expectations put pressures on governments to maintain services while living within existing levels of taxation. The job of budgetary guardians, departments or ministries of finance, and sometimes Treasury Board or its provincial equivalents, is to hold the line in three areas. First, by setting boundaries in the fiscal framework, total spending levels or borrowing levels the government will entertain for the coming fiscal year. They try to get government departments to work within the funding levels established within that fiscal framework. Some spending departments can respond by making program cuts in areas that cause the government political embarrassment, thus increasing pressures to restore budget reductions or expand available budgets. The colloquial term for this is the musical ride technique. Some years ago, the RCMP was facing budget cuts and threatened to eliminate the famed musical ride, a major public relations activity of the force. During the Mulroney years, the CBC responded to budget reductions by closing its station in the Prime Minister's remote Quebec riding. This is the kind of tactic which has led governments to centralize power over budgets, if not always wisely. The language of budget cuts can vary depending on where you stand. For ordinary citizens, increases or reductions, cuts, are most often related to cash income and expense. You might get a 2% increase in your salary or take-home pay, or because of reductions of the hours worked, you might end up with a cut of 10%, to pick a number out of the air, to your paycheck. This approach involves comparing hard dollars within a limited time period. For economists, increases or reductions of income and spending are often calculated net of inflation to determine whether people have greater or lesser purchasing power 1, 2, 5, 10, or how many ever years ago. When comparing across different time periods or jurisdictions with different levels of inflation and population growth or decline, these calculations might be on the combined basis of inflation and population growth to measure changes in real per capita spending, real after inflation per capita measured on the average across a given population. Policy analysts look at relative spending levels both across governments as a whole and for budgeted allocations to individual units. For government departments, especially spending departments and public service unions, actual budget allocations are often assessed relative to previous projections of budget spending. Any budget allocation that falls short of that projection, whether of actually budgeted projections or what levels of spending would be needed to maintain existing programs without any changes, may be viewed as a cut. To give an example, most union contracts have automatic escalators for pay scales that increase with seniority up to a certain ceiling. Such increases are treated as a given, even though from a person on the street perspective, they might look like an automatic 1.7 or 2% pay increase. From a spending department or union perspective, a raise or an increase in budgeted spending would be any contract settlement or any budgetary allocation which increased either the overall pay scale or the overall budget level relative to previous budget allocations or previous contracts, not annual increments within the scale. But a cut would be any budget allocation that required a reallocation of spending from previous projections, even if it resulted in an overall increase in spending from the person on the street or economist's perspective. In the context of guardians and spenders, where you stand depends very much on where you sit. Secondly, guardians in the Department of Finance exercise control of the tax system to limit the erosion of the tax base. In plain English, this can mean limiting the use of tax breaks, sometimes called tax preferences because they give preferential treatment to some kinds of activities, or tax expenditures because they direct resources to particular groups through the tax system. The guardian can avoid the use of tax preferences altogether, or target them narrowly to avoid rewarding their use for unintended purposes. These issues can get particularly sticky when there's the potential for spillover between business and personal expenses. Business expenses being deductible from taxation, personal expenses not being deductible for many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small business owners and self-employed people. However, finance ministers can also function as spending ministers, either by using politically targeted tax breaks or by preempting other spending ministries to deliver certain transfers, like the child tax credit or the GST credit, through the tax system. Thirdly, finance departments can serve as guardians by attempting to enforce spending reviews, either to reallocate resources within or across departments. Examples of this practice are visible in Alberta's pre-pandemic fiscal strategy, which maintained nominal spending levels, that is, before inflation and population growth, for Alberta Health Services and K-12 education, while enforcing actual budget reductions on everyone else. These decisions generally involve a mix of political and economic criteria. Cutting administration and waste are often favorite targets of government. But as those of you who have looked at these questions in the public policy course will remember, it's not always easy to distinguish between administrative and operating costs, particularly when creative administrators can manage data in ways that attempt to avoid producing obvious targets for spending reductions. However, senior public servants who need to secure new funding for major projects are often well advised, as David Good mentions in his article, to find internal savings as a down payment towards the new project, as a way of acknowledging the priorities of the center. Spenders who recognize Guardian's priorities and are thus seen as team players may be given priority over other spenders who don't. Guardians who don't provide such incentives will find that institutionalized selfishness is as central to the realities of government departments as to any other part of society characterized by low levels of trust. Next slide. That's a good lead into micro-budgeting, which involves two major dimensions: the top-down projection of revenues and spending for individual organizations within government or the broader public sector in their main divisions, and the bottom-up management process of organizing budget requirements and allocations carry out the functions of particular government units or organizational units. There may be significant differences in the budgeting processes of different public sector organizations, depending on their relative dependence on budget transfers or allocations by other levels of government, and their capacity and flexibility in raising their own revenues by various means. Government organizations that are heavily dependent on budget allocations from central government agencies must deal with budgeting as a primarily administrative function. Expenditures for each category of activity, wages and salaries, employee benefits, office expenses, occupancy costs, equipment operations and replacement, transfers to individuals or business, and so on, must be accounted for regularly through the budget year. Financial administration regulations spell out the degree to which the flexibility or lack thereof in reallocating funds within a unit's budget. In some cases, units which dispense funds to beneficiaries outside the organization may have to stop doing so if program demand exceeds the supply of funds before the end of the fiscal year. However, for higher profile programs or legislated entitlements, the government may have to submit supplementary estimates to Parliament when benefit payments exceed budget ceilings. This sort of thing is better done before the fact than after the fact. Some organizations formally or informally encourage their managers to build in margins in dispensing revenues during the budget year to avoid running over budget at year end. Such activities can create a variety of perverse incentives. Organizations which fail to spend their full budget allocations experience lapses at the end of the fiscal year in which unspent funds are returned to the central treasury, whether of the organization, say a post-secondary institution, or the government as a whole. Lapses can result from employee turnover during the year, lower than expected demand for particular programs, or operating costs that are lower than expected. In some cases, senior managers will hold lapsed funds pending the completion of collective bargaining agreements, so they will not be caught short if a contract settlement is more expensive than anticipated. And of course, if they have overestimated the value of the contract settlement, they can have increased flexibility for the rest of the fiscal year in allocating the related funds. Unspent funds can then be reallocated to other priorities of central managers, although it's often useful to share a portion of these funds with particular units to address their needs and encourage their cooperation in future budget cycles. Similarly, senior managers facing in-year budget cuts from the center due to revenue shortfalls, or perhaps in a university shortfalls on planned enrollment, may impose freezes on discretionary hiring or the replacement of staff turnover, euphemistically known as workplace attrition, along with restrictions on travel or other expenses to minimize effects on central operating budgets. In other cases, subordinate units may attempt to spend any lapsed funds before the end of the fiscal year based on the use it or lose it principle. Some observers have noted that the sales of new office furniture and equipment are often significantly higher during the last month or two of the fiscal year than earlier on. To avoid this kind of behavior, senior managers can either provide explicit instructions constraining discretionary spending during the last quarter of the year, or allocate a portion of the reserves thus generated to deal with unit priorities with overlap with those of the central organization. They can also reorganize the allocation of funds for areas that have been subject to abuse in past years to a central services organization, which then shifts discretion from the subordinate unit closer to the center. One major function of federal and provincial auditors general is to identify anomalies and inefficiencies in the use of public funds, to develop rules and incentive structures to limit the gaming of budgetary processes. Organizations which raise significant amounts of their own revenues through user fees or the sale of goods and services function in a different environment. Such organizations need to invest significant amounts in business promotion and the internal allocation of resources to areas that generate significant cash flow to offset these activities which, by their very nature, generate greater costs than revenues. For example, in the context of post-secondary education, enrollment levels are an important part of resource allocation, but so is student retention. Some schools have identified a close relationship between living in residence and a higher retention rate, leading them to identify external sources of funds to build student housing, or using a greater share of residence fees for student support services. Organizations can encourage innovative behavior by middle managers by enabling their units to keep a share of funds generated from the development of new products or services, particularly if additional costs must be incurred to generate these revenues, as long as it contributes to the overall objectives of the organization. However, projects that simply shift money from one pocket to another are generally discouraged. For public sector organizations that face significant competition in the delivery of their services, that competition can provide some discipline on user charges or other pricing mechanisms. However, for those that abuse this power, backlash can result in stricter governmental regulation of fee income or even its abolition. Examples include the changes to the User Fees Act in the federal government around in the early part of this century, and provincial regulation of post-secondary tuition fees, or alternately, allowing schools to charge higher fees for degrees whose graduates had better prospects of significantly higher income after graduation. That covers what we plan to deal with today. On Monday, we will explore the ways in which managers use budgetary control and financial management processes to implement budget-financed operations and manage risks. Thanks very much, and we'll see you before Monday.